Thank you. I've moderated now, of course. Colleagues, I've been in trouble most of my life. Yes, I know some of you might find that hard to believe. But it's different now because you're in trouble too. That is, you and I are all in it together, along with our children and grandchildren. But some are not in it with us. 18 out of 29, over two-thirds of the cabinet, are millionaires or multimillionaires. Why does it matter that some own so much more than others? Why does it matter that the incomes of some are so much greater than others? How does this affect the education of our pupils and students? The gap in income and wealth is not just widening, it is becoming a yawning gulf. This is not just because of the continuing rise of those at the very top, but because of the fall in the real pay of the vast majority. In her book, Plutocrats, The Rise of the Super-Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else, Chrystia Freeland, former deputy editor of the Financial Times, writes, in the 2009-10 recovery, 93% of the gains went to the top 1%. But she further points out, even amongst the super rich, the people on the Forbes annual rich list, the greatest gains have been made at the top of the pyramid. Between 1983 and 2000, the top 25% of them got 4.3 times wealthier, while the bottom 75% only got 2.1 times richer. How sad. Since then, the process has only accelerated. To them that hath shall they be given, and to them that hath the most shall they be given even more. For those at the bottom, the poorest in our society, including, we must remember, their children, their real income has been flatlining or even declining for a decade or more. We now have a phenomenon that I am ashamed to have in my country, the burgeoning across the UK of food banks. Not the soup kitchens we have long held for those living on the streets, but food banks for ordinary working people. Those increasing numbers made unemployed, many with children. Those working, but with incomes not enough for them or their children to live on. As your president, I was asked to speak at the press launch about the results of a joint survey organised by ATL and UT and the Children's Society. Highlights of the findings were that 72% of UK teachers are seeing hungry children coming into school with no lunch and no means to pay for one. Almost two-thirds of the teachers asked said that their staff had provided pupils with food or money for food. Hungry children equals poor learning. It is an utter disgrace and national humiliation that the Save the Children Fund has changed its criteria so that Britain is now receiving their aid alongside other third world countries. However, this is perhaps just a recognition of a changing reality. In Going South, Why Britain Will Have a Third World Economy by 2014, written by Larry Elliott, economics editor of The Guardian, and Dan Atkinson, economics editor of The Mail on Sunday, they write of Britain, the biggest budget deficit of any G20 economy. Manufacturing shriveled at 10% of output. No democratic country has ever imposed so great a burden, they say, on its ordinary citizens for the benefit and protection of that country's wealthiest elite. Most people do not want to think far ahead, especially if they think the future might be bleak. Let me say, the future, if we do nothing and allow things to carry on along the same path, will be bleak. Bleaker than most of us can imagine because we have never experienced it. If we are to consider our education system and its future, we have to consider and talk about economics. Without a productive society, we cannot pay for a productive education system. If the amount of money being collected in income tax, corporation tax is going down through evasion, avoidance, deliberate government policy, or laxity of collection enforcement, we will not receive sufficient taxpayers' money for rebuilding, re-equipping and properly staffing our schools. Giant companies, Boots, Amazon, Vodafone, Tesco, Topshop, Starbucks, to name but a few, are not paying their proper taxes. In 2010-11, Boots, for example, on operating profits of £1 billion, paid just 5.9% tax. The actions of these companies have led to widespread protests. Starbucks was so embarrassed that they volunteered to pay some tax. Tax now for multinationals appears to have become voluntary. Richard Brooks, in The Great Tax Robbery, How Britain Became a Tax Haven for Fat Cats and Big Business, writes, between 1999 and 2011, British companies' profits increased by 58%, but the increased tax paid was less than 5%. He continues, the current government boasts it will have the lowest corporate tax rate of any major Western economy, and the lowest rate this country has ever seen. Further, he states that by sending profits to the world's tax havens, with the government's encouragement, British multinationals will shave further billions off already modest tax bills. The richest corporations are not just permitted to dodge their fair contributions, but they are positively encouraged to do so. Such a nation might be called a tax haven, they say, or it might be called Britain. There's plenty of money. The money is available. It's just not going to the right people, the right places, or being used for the right purposes. For example, we have borrowed huge sums, more in the last 7 years in total than in the rest of the UK's history. Much of it to bail out the bankers, making them yet another fortune. By the time of the next general election, it is estimated that our national debt will stand at 1.4 trillion. However, as Money Week, an investors magazine, points out, when you add all our various debts together, it swells to 900% of our GDP. In the Great Depression, America's total debts hit 252% of GDP. During the Japanese economic collapse, debt hit 498%. Ours is now comparable to the worst of the 20th century, the Weimar Republic. Ours, 900%, theirs, 913. History teaches us the great dangers of such a position. Again, why is this important? Our present economic collapse, let's call it what it is, it's not a triple-dip recession, it's a depression. It has already lasted longer than the Great Depression. Mr. Osborne himself now says it will last another 8 years. Figures have been and are constantly being revised upwards. Already our schools are hit. Money for books and equipment slashed. Money for new buildings and refurbishment cut. My school, Copeland, for example, should have been rebuilt years ago. The 2.7 million taken, allegedly, by the ex-head and others from the school funds has not been repaid. None, though they have all been charged, including a charge of money laundering against the ex-head teacher, have yet to face trial nearly 4 years later. The cancellation of the Building Schools for the Future project meant that a lifeline was lost for us. One of our Year 8 pupils, Khadija, did a brilliant piece on the BBC News Schools report, which some of you might have seen. Though Copeland is now on the list to be rebuilt, this is not due to happen until 2017. The unfair inspection system, Ofsted, just recently failed my school, and it will undoubtedly try to turn it into a forced academy. We will fight this injustice tooth and nail. Our profession is being de-skilled, teachers increasingly not needing qualifications, pensions cut, salaries cut, independent schools closing, staff sacked, and we are told that most of the cuts are yet to come. And all this with pupil numbers increasing. Recently, I led the ATL delegation to the ATL Conference, the European section of Educational International in Budapest. A paper by the director, Martin Romer, wrote about a crisis of democracy, an erosion of national sovereignty, and warned of the educational implications of political union. A TES article last June, Teaching in a Climate of Despair, painted a bleak picture. How would you feel if your salary had already been halved in the past 2 years, where some teachers struggle to afford to feed their own children? Pupils have fainted from hunger. Schools shut for days because no one can afford the heating. More than 1,000 schools closed. This is not some fictional nightmare, a disaster in the developing world, nor a grim vision from history. This is Greece, the article said, in 2012. Now, in 2013, it is only worse. And following close behind, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Cyprus, etc. Still, we are not yet, in the same disastrous situation. But the question is, and it is an entirely reasonable question, for how long? In Dickens's David Copperfield, Mr. Micawber says, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, and 6, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6, result misery. Some people have said I talk and write too much about economics. Someone likened me to a Don. I do hope that is an academic one, rather than a mafiosi one. Don Hank Corleone, yes. Mind you, if I was, I'd have known how to deal with someone who was losing the firm so much money. I'd like to congratulate the vast array of you who joined with colleagues and other organisations across the country in creating a veritable storm of opposition to Michael Gove's EBC proposals. No one should underestimate the importance of his climb down, and irrespective of his protestations and intent to get back on course, his position is much weakened. Following Mary's demolition, which I totally endorse, and the no confidence vote, I would say his position, or perhaps I should say his condition, is terminal. I did want to make one more other point about Michael Gove. I hope this clip will encourage you to go and see Rhonda Evans's excellent film on downhills this lunchtime, because I think it says it all.
Well, was it your assessment, Mr. Gove, that commercial considerations were entering into News Corp's thinking at any stage, or was it your assessment that they were purely philanthropic?
I believe that Rupert Murdoch was only interested in establishing a school for purely philanthropic reasons.
Well, if you believe that, you can believe anything, can't you? The book, The Profit Motive in Education, Continuing the Revolution, outlines their worldwide strategy: state education run for profit. It contains a contribution from none other than our own Toby Young. In it, Toby reflects on the difficulties he had in setting up his free school and states that there are unlikely to be many more such schools, he thinks. But the answer for him is clear. The obvious solution is to enable for-profit companies to set up, own and operate free schools. On February the 10th this year, The Independent ran this story. The full extent of Michael Gove's plans to revolutionise education are revealed today in a secret memo, showing he is considering outright privatisation of academies and free schools. All academies and free schools in England, which are the Education Secretary's personal obsession, would be free to become profit-making for the first time and be entirely decoupled from Whitehall control. Not news to ATL, as we had the foresight to write the pamphlet England's Schools Not Open for Business in September 2010, showing how companies were lining up even then to make a profit from state education. Parent power. Do you remember that? Parental choice. Is that why, Mr. Gove, you decided to give yourself the powers to force schools to become academies? Is that giving the parents a choice? Floor targets are raised, and suddenly schools all over England find themselves failing. If you raise the bar high enough, everyone will fail, which is, of course, precisely what you want, so that you can turn those not already academies into academies, ultimately to be run for profit. Parents are increasingly resisting. Resistance is winning. Losing is only if you do nothing. If resistance constantly increases, victory is inevitable. In Brent, Gladstone Park primary parents are resisting. They've joined together with 3 other London schools, Roke, Thomas Gammell and Downhills, to create Parents Against Forced Academies. This is what Rhonda's film, Academies and Lies, is all about. Key is what a parent from Downhill says in the film. If every school did this, it would soon stop. They might not win for their school, but it would definitely stem the tide. Before my conclusion, I will address the issue of professional unity. In my inaugural address, I quoted Brendan Barber. He said, having worked with the teacher unions quite closely on different issues over the years, it seems to me inexplicable why there should be this organisational difference. The people they serve are pretty much identical. There are some differences, but the common issues, he says, absolutely, overwhelmingly outweigh their differences. That was a quote, by the way, taken from the NSUWT magazine, Teaching Today in 2003. 2 years ago, the government launched a frontal assault on our pensions, the biggest attack we had ever faced. The teacher unions understood the need for unity if they were to take on such a powerful and determined enemy. ATL broke the mould. We called the first national strike in our 127-year history, taking action alongside our colleagues in the NUT and UCU. It was very successful. So successful, in fact, that the next time it was mooted, the NSUWT and the NAHT felt that they should join in. This was the strike on the 30th of November, which was undoubtedly the high point of unity in teacher trade unionism in our country's history. It brought forth concessions that the government had absolutely no intention of making. It caused serious rifts within the Conservative Party and the coalition and between the DfE and the Treasury. No one can argue that it was not our unity that achieved this. Why then, one has to ask, are the teacher unions in Britain uniquely so divided? Is this division helpful? No, I don't believe so. I believe it's only helpful to the government. Unity allows for greater strength. Disunity brings weakness. Now is the time, I believe, to seek a broader alliance. It is an option we have been asked to consider in our strategic review, and I believe that there is both a necessity and a duty to establish what the views of the majority of our ordinary members are on this crucial issue. I personally firmly believe that the majority would support greater unity. Do we have hope for the future? Mr. Osborne is a dead man walking, and Mr. Cameron is near there. Is this too political, party political? I think not. A recent Sunday Observer poll showed almost 3 times as many, and that includes Conservatives, 3 times as many voters believe the austerity drive is harming our country as helping. Even Boris Johnson has said it is time to, quote, junk the rhetoric of austerity. Even the IMF have now attacked it. I recently saw the film The Spirit of 45 by Ken Loach. Even during the Second World War, both those at home and troops abroad were planning a new future for Britain. The film explains why there was a Labour landslide in 1945. There's a couple of clips from it.
I think the expectation was we are not going back to the Britain of the 1930s, where it was never again. It wasn't only never again about war, it was never again about that kind of peace.
During the war, we'd always sat and listened to Winston Churchill on the radio. Everybody did. Everybody sat around the radio and listened to Winston Churchill. And as a kid, I mean, that was it to me. He was the leader, and this was, you know, incredible.
He was, and deservedly so, hugely popular as having led the country against the biggest threat we had ever faced, the Nazis. But surprisingly, and very quickly afterwards, surprising to many, the position changed. And the second clip is quite revealing, I think.
I can only tell you that an enormous mass of work
the spirit of the people after the war was for them to be in control of their future, a future where there was a universal free healthcare and education, where transport, power and the utilities were nationalised. We need a new spirit of 45. We must bring an end to the second Gilded Age for the super rich. I have heard what this spirit was firsthand. My friend, Bill Ash, was a Spitfire pilot, shot down, captured, and after the war awarded the MBE for his escaping activities. Bill, in his book Under the Wire, writes, "As a prisoner, when not tunnelling or scrounging food, we had years to ponder what sort of future we wanted and what we were unwilling to return to. Most of our prison camp debates centred on what sort of world we wanted to build after the war. We talked about what it had been like before the war, about the mass unemployment and the children going to bed hungry. He explains that is why Churchill, the greatest of all wartime leaders, whom we all respected as such, was rather promptly and soundly defeated at the ballot box." As I asked earlier, do we have hope for the future? I most certainly do, and I think you should too. As Paul Newman says in the film Cool Hand Luke, before he manages to eat the 50 eggs, it is all about getting your mind right. Remember, the darkest hour is shortly before the dawn. It cannot go on getting worse forever, but we need to turn it round sooner rather than later. There will be a new dawn. We are strong. The going has got tough. Now it's time for the tough to get going.